wanted him to do the history of history, because that's we're really lacking.
Right.
The history of these early settlers that protected the Holden House and all these wonderful people who aren't with us anymore. And I said, Cisco, you're the only one that knows.
Right.
So I want him to do the history.
Get everything written down. It's
he
important.
said he would.
It's important because you get the next wave of dedicated people that come in, and unfortunately, I think you lose a little bit with each generation.
That's right.
Like Cisco's parents, grandparents would have known a whole heck lot more,
yes,
than Cisco would have, and it's just important to try and get down as much as you can get down, which is why we're doing this today. It's why I taped Diane Marquis giving a tour of the schoolhouse, because she's been there since before anything was in that building.
That's correct.
Other than FFA, and you have to get it from the horse's mouth, so to speak.
Well, I fell upon Cisco land, so to speak, as an outsider, a total outsider, and by some miracle they accepted me among the good old boy network.
Right.
And I think that had a lot to do with the internet.
Yeah.
Because we set up the internet and no one knew what it was, and it was this mysterious thing that we were working on.
There was a commercial on TV that I saw last night that had the heads of all these different big corporations like L'Oreal and just big things, and they each gave 30-second blurbs about how technology has changed for them because of all of this, and how it's going to help them serve humanity better in the future. And I'm sure a good part of that's true.
Well, I think it's important to record it, because I was fascinated when I came here, and it was just an attraction.
Right.
That was through Al Hadid, who's a great historian, and he truly had the history of history.
Right.
But that took me into it, and I urged Cisco last night to finish it.
Right.
I said, come on, this is important.
Yeah.
But he's doing his genealogy stuff too.
Right.
And so he's got many projects that he wants to do.
People like me, Preston's another one that he's after a year and a half of working with him, the guy is still a dry sponge that just soaks everything up that comes his way, and I guess because of his military service, he's a bit of an insomniac, up all hours of the night, and I'll say goodnight to him at say 9:30, 10 o'clock at night, and the next morning, I look at my messages and he's sent me information or questions.
Oh, he's wonderful.
Right up until the time I wake up, and he says, well, I think I'm going to go take a nap now.
I steered him toward Hewitt DuPont.
Right.
And Hewitt DuPont is another walking encyclopedia. And he has essentially what Preston wants. Preston's looking for villages or settlements in your area on the north side of Old Kings Road.
Right.
Now, we all know about Matanzas. We know it was there. Preston or Hewitt's relatives lived there.
Right.
And there is another settlement that I know of, but I can't tell them. The DuPonts had another settlement on the Atlantic side, on the coast. And they were there. And I think that information has to come from Hewitt.
Right. Yeah.
But he's trying to research your area.
Right.
And I've given him everything I've got, but there's more.
Yeah.
If he gets a hold of DuPont.
Some of the key people.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So we are sitting in the garage of Bill Ryan. Bill Ryan has been a long-term historian with the Flagler County Historical Society, the author of 7 books. He's working on his 8th one, and we're going to talk a little bit about some things that are on both of our minds, and then also his time on the farm. We're going to call it the farm. So with where we're at right now, what are the most important things that you want us as a historical society to continue to work on, to fill in the gaps, projects that we should be doing? What are some of your thoughts as far as the organization?
Well, locals come here have been coming here for some 400 years. This has fascinated me. Under the French, under the Spanish, under the British, and then the Americans, they were all attracting people here in this area, one for one reason or another. But these were all outsiders. They weren't locals. The locals soon died from disease, all the coronavirus, the local Indians. And what does a historical society exist? What's the purpose of a historical society? I think it's to collect and record the stories. Now, the stories, sometimes they'll be the stories of the people coming in, but sometimes they'll be the stories of what went on here. And the two tend to intermingle. You can't separate one from the other. It's a collection of stories. The frustration I've always had with the people that collect genealogy, it's mostly names and dates, but they rarely have the stories. These stories just don't get written down. For example, my mother survived the 1918 flu epidemic, and half of her classmates died. And yet, she never wrote anything. I heard her tell me, and I failed to write it down too. So the recording of stories, I think, is very important. Why? Because it's a guidance to the future. I spent a lot of my career in Europe, a lot. And I would drink beer with German officers of the World War II vintage. We're in the German army. And over enough beers, I was the only American they knew, and they would say, Ryan, don't be so proud of your country. What happened to us could happen to you. And what is your defense? It's history. It's knowing what happened in Germany in 1938, what happened here during 1918, what occurred in the Seminole War, very appropriate. Seminole War was identical to Vietnam. It was a repeat of Vietnam. So if you don't know history, you're doomed to repeat it.
So really, with that then, our immediate focus needs to be on putting together a list of all of the pillars and elders in the community that have been here for generations, maybe people in their 70s, 80s, 90s, and get their video histories down.
Yes.
And stories, maybe top 10 most important facts, lessons, or anything that comes to their mind, really, before it's too late, effectively. Otherwise, those small little tidbits, it's like seasoning in food. You can just put everything in a pot and it tastes pretty good until you start putting salt and pepper and all that other stuff in there, and then you've really got something that's fascinating.
Well, also figuring out how to record. I mean, you're shooting a video. 3 years from now, this video may be obsolete and no one can see it. I started the first internet during something called HTML. Well, it still works today, but a lot of the stuff on it doesn't work. Right. And things change technically. Your precious DVD disc, we found out to our horror, only had about a 12 to 14 year life. Yeah. Then they start to go. Yeah. So another challenge is, how do you record it? I've always favored the written word or the printed document, mainly because, as your files will show, you're full of old documents. Right. And they're still there maybe 100 years later. Right. But so much of our digital world is fragile as a butterfly. What you see today isn't going to work tomorrow. Right. And the technology is moving so quickly. So a big challenge, other than recording, is keeping it. Right. How do you categorize it? How do you keep it? How do you put it in a form that someone could find and look at 100 years from now? Right. Wouldn't you love to know what they had for lunch on the plantations here? What did the slaves eat? what happened at lunchtime? What were their meals consisting of?
Right.
What did people eat?
You know, on that note, as I'm listening to you, I'm thinking that maybe as part of a policy, and I may actually put this on our agenda for tomorrow's board meeting, that we set up some kind of regular assessment of what is now state of the art for information storage.
Yes.
And then say every 5 years, 10 years, we redo all of our digital storage into the best new technology. Because like you said, you know, on the DVDs, the aluminum will develop hits, it'll degrade,
Yes.
it'll deteriorate, and it's worse than a scratched record. At least with a scratched record, you can still hear it with noise, but when you have a DVD that goes bad, that thing's not going to play at all, and you almost need you know, an FBI investigator to be able to decode what you've got on there.
My son is a computer engineer of the highest level, working on the cloud and corporate internet for the whole world. And he has told me how fragile this cloud is, or our storage. It's like a butterfly in the wind.
Right.
You know, now you see it, now you don't. Very
Right.
fragile.
I watched a movie 2 nights ago on Netflix. It was called A Rim of the World. It was about these kids that go to a summer camp, and each kid has a troubled, you know, background. But as they're all there trying to learn how to work together, suddenly the planet Earth is invaded by you know, these aliens. And the first thing that they do is they deliver a tremendous electromagnetic pulse
And away
that
goes.
hits the entire planet.
Yes.
And every vehicle with a computer, every cell phone, every computer is completely erased and wiped out.
Yet books would survive and your printed word would survive.
Right.
I'm writing this thing on photography, which happens to be my background. If you ordered a print in 1918 from a professional photographer, that print might be good for 200 to 300 years.
Right.
Still observable, still non-faded 200 years later. I can't say that about our digital world. A print today might not be around 10 years from now, even assuming you made a print, which hardly anyone does anymore,
Right.
because drugstores don't exist.
Right.
But this was my world, and this is the book I'm writing about. But the thing that this keeps coming over and over again, the fragility of information, the ethereal nature of images, the weakness of our digital age in informing the future. We might inform the present, we might be surrounded with information, but how much of that information will be around 100 years from now? I
Right.
wonder.
Yeah. Another weak link in the chain for the printed material is protection from flood, fire,
Oh, yeah, that's always
things
true.
like that, which we know we need to work on there at the annex, you know, just in case something were to happen. So let me ask you this: with all of with the books that you've written about Flagler County history, and the current book that you're writing on right now, what other topics or subjects would you still have on your mind that need to be written about, explored, and
There are so
documented?
many. I wish I had the time. I'm talking to Mrs.
Studnicki?
Skudnicki.
Yep.
She wants to do Mr. Hernandez, and he was a fascinating character. Not a very likable guy. He was a beaver. He was a experimenter. He liked agriculture. He liked making money. He loved getting land on shaky terms. But he was an interesting guy. And he was the first Hispanic governor of Florida. He's the first Hispanic member of our U.S. Congress. He was a hell of a soldier. He was a really effective, good soldier, and basically a civilian.
Right.
But he's a fascinating guy. No book has ever been written about him,
Hernandez.
to my knowledge.
Okay.
We've covered Old Kings Road pretty well. There's still some mysteries about Hewitt Mill, as you know.
Right.
And you've got some mysterious, maybe the first railroad in America, maybe.
You know, that was one of the things that Hewitt DuPont had spoken about with Preston, is that Hewitt's either grandfather or great-grandfather had said that the railroad that ran through there may not necessarily have been colonial, but it was extremely early 1800s.
Okay, that makes sense.
Like before 1812, possibly. And it was donkey, they called it donkey engine.
But there's so many mysteries out there.
Right.
Unknown mysteries.
Yeah.
So a very good book could be written about that area.
Actually, Hewitt told Preston, and Preston is now chomping at the bit, that I guess years ago, when Hewitt was just young, they were hunting in that area around Ranch House where the bridge is.
Yes.
And at one point during a very low water level day, and the water was very clear, they actually spied wheels that probably came off of one of the rail carts laying in Hewlett's Branch, at the bottom of Hewlett's Branch.
See, we know almost nothing about this.
Right.
Now, Cisco Dean reflects, let's call the 1880s. The Dean family coming in here, the settlement of Bunnell and the farms and so forth, which surprisingly is a very narrow slice. Another area that we haven't really touched on is there have been books written about this, is the ITT era, taking this up to present times. But my leaning has always been stories, and I remain very indifferent to list of dates and places. Dates don't mean that much, because you'll find the same people were alive in the American Revolution that were alive in other periods.
Right.
You know, they moved through history. I wrote a book about this called I Am Gray Eyes, and I actually found a linkage from him to the lost colony of Sir Walter Raleigh and all that.
Right.
And it's there. So there are so many connections, but they're through outsiders coming in, carrying their own story. They don't get written down.
I think when I look back on my education, the reason why I wasn't a big fan of history back in junior high school, even college, is because anytime somebody started talking about not only years, but months and days, it became a list of things that I would get glazy in the eyes.
Yeah.
You know, just trying to figure out what all of that was.
You're memorizing days.
Yeah,
and who cares?
And that kind of killed it for me, you know.
Who cares?
But really, because of you and people like Cisco and others, when you hear the characters and the stories and the struggles of life and the challenges and people's philosophies, that to me is fascinating, because we can take their experiences and apply them to today. And then with that, I find something interesting with me, like with de Bram. You know, for as much as I've read about de Bram, because I find him to be a fascinating character, all of a sudden, from learning just the stories, the dates are falling in almost like photographic memory, you know, where I can pull out and say, oh, hey, you know, the ship left St. Augustine on, you know, whatever, and there's no way that I would have been able to have that in my head.
He was a genius, but one with an abrasive personality. He offended people.
Yeah.
And yet, on the other hand, he was a genius.
He offended people, and he also he lost his temper. There was, I'm sure you've seen this, when they went out west from the Carolinas to build Fort Loudon. De Bram had gone with the captain and a detachment of the British Army, and they went into Indian Territory to build this fort. And de Bram picked a location that neither the military captain nor the Indians nor the locals liked, and an argument ensued. And de Bram got extremely pissed off because nobody wanted the fort where he said it needed to be. So on Christmas Eve, there was an argument between him and the captain of the military, and de Bram pulled out his pistol and handed it to the captain and said, why don't you just put a bullet in my head and end my misery right now? And the captain said, sir, I'm not going to do that, but if you would like to do it on your own, I will not stop you.
Well, he was in my opinion, the first scientific surveyor
Right.
that used science.
Yeah.
And yet, when we sent this out to this Atlantic group, Cisco talked to me last night about that. He finally got around to reading that Atlantic report. And he said, when are you going to get the thumb drive? He said, this is issue number 2.
Right.
And I said, I don't know, I don't have it.
Yeah.
And so it is important. Cisco said this is very important
Yeah.
stuff.
It's an amazing compilation, and it's a great summary, which is why we need to print it off and put it in a binder. How are you?
Hey, I'm good.
Good.
I didn't want to mess up your video.
Oh no, that's good. It's no worries.
I see my daughter Debbie walking.
Yeah, she's behind.
But in answer to your question, another topic is this guy DeBron.
Right.
He lived here for over 5 years.
Right.
And but all of these outsiders coming in with their independent stories are worthy of recording. I don't have the years left in me to do it. I anticipate that I'll be blubbering in my oatmeal soon. And senility, I'm 80, well, I'll be 88 in September.
Right.
And we were originally going to talk about the prison. I had a wild and adventuresome childhood, the only way I can describe it, because I ended up in that Florida or Illinois prison, leaving a oil boom town of Salem, Illinois in 1938, which was right out of the people in the movies. You know, it was like a movie set.
And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to speak to you about that in particular. Did you get a chance to watch that movie, Secondhand Lions, yet?
Not yet.
Not yet.
Not yet, but
So-
I told Dad. Yeah.
So Secondhand, like you watched it, I lent
No,
it
I've
to you.
seen
it.
Yeah. So Secondhand Lions for me is the guy's version of a chick flick. It's a movie about a young, impressionable boy who gets dropped off, abandoned really, on the doorstep of his mother's uncles. And these two uncles have, traveled the world, and the kid doesn't know them. It's on a farm in the middle of Texas, in the middle of nowhere. He's upset. He knows he's been abandoned. These guys are peculiar, they're particular. But over time, their quirkiness is overshadowed by their knowledge and their determination to turn this boy into a man, a knowledgeable man, and a respectful man, and somebody that's going to go and change the world. And when I heard the story from your dad about his life on this prison farm, and his friends who were all forgers and convicts. And
Well, they had a
thieves.
class. The top was a bank robber, your bunco man, your smash and grabs, but there were different categories. And your status within the prison depended on what you did in your line of work.
Right.
So I learned many useful things.
So how old were you when you and your family moved to the farm?
Oh, I couldn't. I was born in 1932, so we appeared in the prison farm around 1940.
1940. Okay, so you're about 8.
Yeah, about 8.
All right, and you and your trusty 22 would wander the property looking for rabbits.
Well, we had 800 acres of land, and it was river bottom land on the Kaskaskia River, which flooded every spring. And so I had 800 acres of farmland and a flexible flyer bicycle and a 22 rifle, and my parents never knew where I was.
Right.
So I would leave in the morning and have a new adventure each day.
Right. And some of the adventures also included fishing.
Well, yeah, fishing.
Unconventional fishing.
Well, we dynamite the river. You know, the boys down at the pump house were already in prison. I mean, you can't go to prison for dynamiting a river when you're in prison. And they get 8 or 10 cents a pound for fish from the local farmers. And I would ride the prison bus into Vandalia every day to go to school. And I would pick up packages of carbide, which they made bombs out of, and bring them back for them. They'd give me money, and this little kid would...
Now, nobody else knew about that, it was just you and them.
I'd never squeal.
Okay.
That was one of the things I learned.
Right.
You don't.
You don't turn in your friends.
You don't turn in your friends. but I mean, it was a world.
Right.
Now, this wasn't a terrible prison. These were guys that, there's a prison farm, and it raised the food for the other prisons. But we had people that were on life sentences at Joliet, Menard, for crimes, murder, multiple killings. And when they were still in their 60s, as a reward for good behavior, they'd be transferred to Vandalia. And some of these older guys were mass killers, murderers, but they were 60, 70 years old. Rather nice people.
So they all kind of took you under their wing, really. I mean,
yeah, I never felt uneasy with any of them. They were all my buddies.
Right.
I was the only kid there.
Right.
And
And you had a dog, right? Didn't you
I
have
had a dog, yeah, Spot, a fox terrier.
Right.
And
So did the dog accompany you on your?
oh yeah,
your
the
adventure?
dog was very smart. It always knew that rabbits would run in a circle. If you chase a rabbit in the field, the rabbit will always run in a circle. It won't run in a straight line. The dog finally got so smart that it would cut across the circle and meet the rabbit coming
Right.
up.
Huh.
But it never killed a rabbit. It would just catch it.
Right.
It wouldn't kill it. But I'd kill rabbits. My mother used to get so mad at me. She said, "Don't bring me home any more rabbits," because I never missed. I was a dead shot. I could hit a running rabbit.
Now, in that theme, since you never missed, were you aiming for the prisoner when you shot him in the shoulder?
Well, no, it was his fault. I mean, the rabbit was going up the hill, and he was coming up the hill on the other side.
Right.
I didn't see him. It was only a 22 short, and I hit him in the arm, and he thought it was pretty funny.
So were there other prisoners around that heard the shot and saw it and came rushing?
Oh,
or-
we were out in the woods, out in the country.
So it was just the two of you?
Just the two of us.
Right.
Yeah, he didn't say anything about it. He went to the infirmary, had it patched up, and I certainly wasn't going to tell anything.
But they didn't turn you in and...
Oh, God, no.
So your dad never found out about that?
He never found. I would never
found
tell him.
Wow.
No.
Now there was also a still, there was
Oh,
moonshine?
there was the largest still ever discovered. The prison bakery had a huge bakery. Remember, they baked bread for other prisoners. And in the overhead, the bakery oven was this monster still. And they made it from raisins. And the inmates were wild for hot raisin pie. Everybody loved hot raisin. Well, of course, it was to get the raisins to make the alcohol. And at that time, grain alcohol sold at a tremendous price. So they had these big milk cans full of grain alcohol that they'd ship to the rail station in Vandalia for shipment up to Chicago. Now the guards were in on it. I mean, the guards knew all about it. And I knew about it because I got raisin pie,
Right.
hot raisin pie. But the truck wrecked one day. I wasn't on it. And the big cans upset, and there was all that grain alcohol, running away.
Right.
But they had this immense still over the prison bakery. But that goes on. I mean, people make a life. I mean, this prison's their life.
Right. Now, when they were distilling the alcohol, were they using yeast, or what were they using to ferment it? Because you also have a story about...
Yeah, well, that was my Navy story.
Yeah.
I had Mr. Truman had just integrated the service, and we had I had an African-American young man, very educated, swell guy. I liked him, and he worked for me in the office. And we were in Charleston, and they had an island in the river in Charleston where their family had been there for 100 years. And they were in the bootlegging business, what they did. And in the barn, they had this big wooden vat where they took the grain and the stuff and fermented it. Well, they had mules. And they said that if they bought yeast, they'd get caught. So they used mule poo, shovels of mule poo.
You know that?
Because they'd throw that in the vat, and that would start the fermentation. And then, of course, they had a big distillery, with copper coils and stuff. And I mean, you're not going to get mule poo in the final product,
Right.
although it might have added to the flavor.
Yeah.
Sure it did.
But they had fried chicken. God, she could fix fried. But their family had been on that island for, 100 years or more. And he invited me. He had to go there by.
I'm going to have to talk to the head of the African American Cultural Society about that story and see if that's, a common thread with an ethnic thread, or if that's just what all moonshiners did when they didn't want to get caught, you know.
Well, you had to make the stuff work, and if you bought yeast in the quantities they needed, you'd get caught.
You get caught, yeah.
Yeast or sugar.
They were tracking it.
Sure.
Just like they track gunpowder or fertilizer.
But this outfit had been operational for over 100 years. They lived there on the island.
Right. Now going back to the prison farm, how did your dad get the job as the warden?
That's wild.
Because that's also wild.
That's bizarre. Okay, first of all, he was involved in running the wire room for the Daily Racing Form, and this was owned by great newspaper magnates, people that were in control of Gannett, and these people owned all the newspapers in America. The Racing Form was your teletype or telegrapher that delivered the racing results. So not bootleggers, what do I mean?
Betting or gambling?
Betting parlors needed to get this information. Now the information was perfectly legal, but they controlled the parlors. In other words, if you didn't take their service, people would pay a visit to you, and you wouldn't want the results. They wouldn't be nice at all.
Right.
And so they really controlled all the bookings in the United States. But these are the guys that own these newspapers. These people in New York, and Chicago, they were very wealthy, rich men. And my father ran the wire room for one of these, and then he ended up in California. That's where I was born, in San Francisco. But it got really rough with Al Capone, and he was trying to take over, and the 1920s, 1930s, people were being killed left and right, machine guns, all sorts of stuff. So apparently my father fled to Robinson, our family home. He got out of there, and he needed something to do. So they were in the oil business, so they said, well, go to Salem. Boy, it's really jumping down there. They've got oil and the big inch pipeline. So we ended up in this oil boom. I was a little kid going to school. None of my classmates had shoes. Everybody wore bib overalls. The pumps ran night and day. There were oil pumps in our playground. At night, you had all the flares burning the methane gas. So you never saw the sun, ever. The sky was always gray with clouds of burning gas, and no grass would grow. You'd never see grass. And the roads were just mud piles. So he built a little empire there. He built a lumberyard, a restaurant called Bill's Good Food. He built about 40 houses, and they called it Ryan's Corners. Well, he was on borrowed money. He didn't have any money of his own. So he became a manager for a guy running for Congress by the name of Charles Versailles. And Versailles got elected to Congress. Well, apparently my father's investors one morning woke up to the fact that they weren't getting any return on their money. So the next thing I knew, we left Salem and we were down at this Vandalia, which was a political appointment as assistant warden, chief clerk.
Right.
Now we're on a prison farm. But that was literally overnight. I mean,
now, there was another venture that your dad had. Didn't he buy hulls?
Well, yeah, that was his big thing.
Right.
At that time, there were no safeties. They'd blow a well in, they'd just bulldoze a pit, and the oil would come in and fill up the pit with oil. You know, it would contaminate the earth forever.
Yep.
And there were no Christmas trees or elaborate things. And to drill a well, you need lubrication. And he discovered that lubricant was cottonseed hulls mixed with water, and they'd pump that down the well, and that would keep the drill from binding and breaking. And so he bought, God knows how he paid for it, an entire train, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of cars of cottonseed hulls, which were of no value to anyone. And he had it parked on a siding. I remember him taking me out there and saying, our future, this is our future. And there was this entire train of these cottonseed hulls,
Yeah.
which were used and were valuable for the oil well drilling. But it was Wild West. I mean, sometimes the well would explode, and there was something to do. They'd take me out, and it would be burning, and the big fire, and it would be so hot it would melt the derrick. And eventually the derrick would melt and go over. But they had a guy called Red Adair, and he used dynamite. And they would set off a big dynamite charge at the burning well, and it would burn up all the oxygen, and the fire would
Shut it
go out.
off, right.
Well, for a kid, this was marvelous. I mean, to go out and watch a well blow up, I mean, that was just...
There seems to be a theme of explosives.
Well,
here.
yeah, and it
You know,
leads
because-
all the way into Vestal when I was a baby. So.
Because there's another story that involves a flammable metal when you were working for, was it Ansco or?
Well, yeah, but that involved alcohol.
Okay.
Uh,
As to start the fire, or as far as?
Well, I got hired out of college, and we were in the middle of the Eisenhower Depression. Nobody had jobs. I mean, there was no jobs, and I was very depressed. And my wife Pat had a job, and she was our income, at that time. And I went out to a job fair, and there was this older man showed up from Ansco in Binghamton. And I got hired. They had about 9 engineers from RIT, and they hired me from UB, and I have no idea why. But anyway, so we ended up there, and I wrote a paper about the U.S. Patent Office because Ansco had the first patent on roll film. They invented roll film. Kodak took credit for it, but Ansco had the patent. So Ansco won the suit, got $8 million in gold set on a special train from Kodak, okay? Now they're having the 100th anniversary of the U.S. Patent Office, and our CEO was to go there and give a speech. And so they gave me all these papers, and I wrote a document about it, and they printed it in color, and it was a huge hit. It made all the newspapers, and our CEO came back smiling. And the next thing I knew, I was in the ad department in charge of an $80 million company ad program. And I didn't know what I was doing. I mean, I was there. He said, I want Ryan, next thing I knew, that I was there. And they're a brand new administration building out in Vestal.
Right.
So we got a house. I was on starvation wages, and I bought a house for $17,000 on a GI loan, no interest, And I'm next door to a Polish coal miner by the name of Bernie Gazek. And Bernie was an interesting fellow. He had only one eye. He was a gunner in a B-25 bomber, and the Japanese were taking his field, and they had all these cases of beer. So they loaded the bomber with all this beer, and they put so much beer in the bomber that they couldn't get off, and he crashed in the woods, and he lost his eye. But anyway, he was my next door neighbor, and he always kept blasting powder in the explosive in his basement in case he needed it. And we lived on the side of a mountain, so we had a flagstone driveway, and it was full of wasps. And these wasps would chase you. They were yellow jackets. And we had a little wine on the weekend. And so he said, well, I think moth crystals will get rid of those. So we tucked all these moth crystals in the stones. All it did was made them madder. So then he said, well, I think if we put some gasoline in, we can burn out those, we'll burn them out. So we poured gasoline and let it soak into the stones, these big flagstones. And pretty soon there's this white, misty stuff coming out, like a white gas of some sort. And he said, well, we got to make it light up. I'll take just a little piece of this blasting powder. He took a little teeny piece and put a cap on it and fuse. We tucked it under the stone. Well, we lit it. And it was amazing. It wasn't an explosion. It was more like an uplifting. The whole driveway lifted into the air and tumbled into the drive. It took me a year and a half to build, to put it back. I became a stonemason.
See, now that's interesting because recently on YouTube, I just came across a video of a guy that was trying to get rid of ants, and I'm sorry, moles. So he had a kind of a small backyard, maybe about the size of this garage, and he was pouring gasoline into all the mole holes and tunnels.
Makes sense.
And he lit it. You know, 3 matches. The first 2 matches went out. Third match goes right in the hole. You can see it on the video. And literally the entire backyard, you heard a woof. It was like a woof.
Yeah, it was a woof.
And the whole backyard at once lifted up.
Wow.
And it seemed like everything turned upside down and landed again.
It wasn't an explosion. It was a woof.
There was 2 dogs. The dogs actually got pushed up against the fence, and he tried running and jumping over the fence, but it was too late. So he's standing there covered in dirt, looking at everything.
Needless to say, Polish Bernie was.
The wall. This is the house today from Google.
Okay.
There's the stone wall, and that's the actual house.
And there it is. Okay, how about that?
Polish Bernie was an interesting neighbor,
Right.
and we would howl at the moon. His hobby was astronomy. He only had one eye, and he was polishing this big mirror, and he made this giant telescope, and it had this mirror. And he came over one day, and he dropped the mirror, and he couldn't look, and he wanted me to see if it was broken. But he built this huge telescope, and he had one eye, but he was an interesting fellow.
Yeah. It wasn't an explosion, but I guess I would call it a vertical tunnel of fire at the camera factory was shavings of.
Where'd you hear that?
I heard it from you.
Okay, I went with another company called Calumet Photographic in Chicago, and I was the president now and general manager. It was owned by a German guy who immediately decamped to Florida. So he was the owner. I was running this big company, and we had some engineers from Bell and Howell. Well, I was always full of ideas. And I said, guys, what we really need is an all-metal 8x10 camera. At that time, the only big camera made was a Deerdorf, made in wood, very clumsy. And people shot 8x10. So Bernie, or rather the engineer said, we'll make one out of, what's that lightweight metal?
Magnesium.
Magnesium.
Yeah.
And we'll make I know how to do magnesium castings. And we'll make an amazing camera that's just feather light, and you can shoot your 8x10 pictures. It'll be a huge success. So he designed an 8x10 view camera, and we machined magnesium. So you'd have barrels of magnesium shavings, and they'd go back to a metal recovery place in Chicago, someplace. Well, one day, the guy at the recovery place said, no, that can't be, those cannot be magnesium. Nobody machines magnesium. A, it's too dangerous, and nobody uses magnesium anyway. Here, I'll show you how as a test. I take a little bit of acid, and I'll pour this on the shaving, and I can tell it's magnesium by the reaction. Well, it went off like a 12-gun shotgun shell and bored a magnesium flame fire through, I guess, 2 stories in the building, just bored a hole with this flaming column of white magnesium flame went into the air. It was a spectacular, to say the least. But we made a lot of things. We invented a film that was used on the moon launch. In fact, it's still on the moon, called 220. I concocted a film that would fit in the magazine of Hasselblad, and I got Kodak to make it for me. And I had exclusive marketing rights for it because I sold it to school photographers. And that ended up on the moon. But we made many inventions at that time, many things.
One of the things that you had wanted to talk about was it the first printer? Was it the first digital printer?
Well, that's you're standing behind.
Yeah, because you wanted to.
This was crazy. I was a madman. I was insane, and so here I am with this company and at Calumet, and I read an article in Popular Science about in World War II, they had a printer in bombers that could make a color map, and they described it, and it was a digital printer, and they could send a signal through the air and they could make a map, a color map. Well, it was made by Minnesota by Honeywell, and I wrote a letter to Honeywell and said, "Is this thing still available? Could I buy it?" And the reason why I thought this might have promise, and I got a call back from the CEO, the president of Honeywell, and he said, "Mr. Ryan, would you fly to Denver? I'd really like to discuss this." And so we got on an airplane and flew to Denver, and they made a joint venture with me. They put up $40 million initially, engineering, because his engineers were after him to do the same thing. And here I'm from the photo industry, said, yeah, maybe somebody might buy this. The problem that I faced, and Jim will verify this, digital cameras hadn't been made, they hadn't even been thought of. Digital cameras didn't exist. The digital world was so far in the future, and we were producing results that were unbelievable. I had this German engineer in Nuremberg that made the developing machine, and I had this secret military Kodak process called RA4, which was a high temperature color process that I had access to. And we built a developing machine that fit right on this Honeywell print engine, and it would spit out digital prints, ka-chunk, 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 ka-chunk. And these were marvelous, but this is before there were digital. And I think I had the first digital camera ever made on memo loan from Eastman Kodak, and it was a Nikon with a CCD cell in the back, which they built for the space program. And I took a picture of Pat, which I think I've still got, and that was one of the first digital photos ever made. And we did that on this color paper. And so I showed it at the Jacob Javits Center, big convention. I spent a lot of money, $80,000 on the display. And it was a flop because we were doing all this and no one believed us. No one would believe us. They thought we was faking, that we had a roll of color prints in there coming out from an already developed roll. No, the technology was so far in advance that their minds, they couldn't grasp.
You couldn't grasp the necessity.
They couldn't grasp what we were doing. And,
one of the things that always entertains me is when he tells me this story, he likens it to the one episode, I think it was Monty Python, where they've invented the airport and they've invented the truck that had the steps on it to take out to the plane.
but no airplane.
But they haven't invented the airplane yet.
Right.
You know?
So they kick you off them and say, fly. And this was, Jim will verify, this is exactly what we were up. We sold some, but in the meantime, Honeywell decided to divest themselves of their military side. So we were in spin-offs, and each time there was a spin-off, there would be all these lawyers with black suits and briefcases. And here I am trying to run a business, and I'm getting battalions of lawyers and new divisions. They were on
engineers, yeah.
And they were on the New York Stock Exchange and Alliant Tech Systems. And here I am trying to run this little business. Jim's trying to do the scientific. And to put it bluntly, we bit off more than we could chew. We couldn't pull it off. I sold some machines. I sold them to the US government. My next client was, of all people, the park here in Orlando, Disney World. And they were one of my big customers anyway, I knew them well. And they could use it. And they were ready to buy my system, but it didn't happen. I went to Palm Coast.
So here's a question now. One of the things that you and I have talked about often over breakfast is we've had successes in our lives and we've had spectacular,
Failures.
glowing failures
Spectacular.
that are worthy of a salute and 21 gun sounding.
Amazing
Wall
failures.
explosion.
Oh well, yeah, it was a wall blowing up the backyard. So here's a question for those that are coming down the pike, so to speak, that have grand visions, they have got a plan, and they get invested in a project that does not work out well and fails miserably. what's the single most important thing, or list of things that people need to keep in mind in order to persevere through the tough times?
Have hope that you can do it again. I gave my daughter this lecture. She's CEO of a huge company in Valdosta, and they're hurt terribly by this corona. She may lose her job, the company may close, but if you've got tomorrow, I showed up here when I was 62 years old, built an internet, got involved in history, wrote books, got involved in self-publishing with Amazon. There's always a tomorrow. If you've got your health and you've got hope for the future, there's nothing you can't do. But the minute you lose that hope, and to be blunt, when I lost Pat, my hope disappeared. I haven't had any hope. But it's drifting back. It's a little hard to keep me down, and hope is the most important. Hope that you can do something, that there is a tomorrow. And I believe this. There was hope in 1918, there was hope here in the 20s, there was hope in 1940, and that motivated people to go for tomorrow.
So as people try and find hope, even though it's through the eyes of despair, what things do you look to refresh yourself with a sense of hope?
I haven't found it yet. Writing is fun for me. Research, I like to find new things. When I found Osceola's family, the portrait hanging in the British Museum, and that was Diane Marquis did that for me. And I found a painting that was hanging in the British Museum labeled as Pocahontas. So there was always some new, exciting adventure. Hewitt's Mill, an early railroad. My goodness. There's always something out there. There's always a story that no one has seen. And you fall upon one of these. And it can be really fun when you find something new that's lying there that no one's seen, and you're the first guy to pick it up. It's like walking on the beach and seeing a gold coin that has been uncovered. Well, it's the same thing. Those coins are there. It's just a matter of finding them. And they give you motive to go forward.
Last subject, because I know you guys have to get going here shortly. Talk a little bit about signposts along the way that seem to be unified by a common thread. And there's a word for it. You're touching on it in this new book right now.
Yeah, the book is about synergy.
Right.
Synergy is a made-up word, but synergy happens to everybody in life. This is the event that can't be explained. You're in Paris, France, you turn a corner, and there's an old classmate from high school standing there. You're on a destroyer, you're about to drown, you know you're going to die, and somebody goes over the rail and saves you. These things happen to everybody.
You're sitting in Serafina's. I don't know if you've heard this story or not, but I had the night before, periodically I go on eBay, and I type in Bunnell and Flagler Beach, and I see what comes up, postcards or mementos. So I typed in Bunnell the night before, and here's a photograph, actual photograph with original writing on the back of the first police chief for Bunnell, and it said Donnie Brock was the guy's name. So I showed it to Bill and Pat at breakfast the next morning. I said, look what I found, they're selling this. I said he was the first sheriff of Flagler County, Donnie Brock, and here's the actual photo on eBay. All of a sudden, from the direction of the cash register, a voice says, it wasn't sheriff, it was police chief. So I looked at him and I said, do you know Donnie Brock?
He said,
I am Donnie Brock. And all of us looked at each other and said, holy crap. You know, so here comes Donnie Brock walking over. He goes, my picture's on eBay. So I showed it to him.
Pat and I are laying bricks. We're building a brick path at the library to the new gazebo. And we know nothing about laying bricks, but we're still laying bricks. And this black guy walks up, this African American, older man. He said, I know something about laying bricks. Let me help you. He said, my father was a bricklayer. This was Dr. Augustus Prince. We didn't know at that moment that he was a world-renowned nuclear physicist of world class, retired here. And his wife was a PhD in education. These were famous people. And he walked up to us and said, let me help you lay these bricks. Well, later I got involved with him. He rewrote Einstein's theory of relativity, which I had something to do with. And it was published, and the funeral was held here at the Methodist Church. The day of the funeral, Pat and I were leaving to go to the funeral. A messenger came up our driveway with this immense package, which was Gus's published works, published in London, sent to us by messenger, arrived the moment of his funeral. Now come on, guys.
Yeah.
If you don't think there isn't somebody writing the script,
Right.
and this isn't just me, this is everybody.
So you have to have hope, and you have to watch out for the signs. Do you find that if you have a mindset of expectation that hope is going to come and the signs are going to come, that they always come?
They do. And ministers talk about this. They make an entire religion out of this. You know, they gave names. They call it miracles, or there's all sorts of theories. But you know, I find it in history, it's always existed. And a lot of your great philosophers have written learned treatises on this. Call it what you will, but there seems to be more to this life than just us coming as an insect, evolving as a bug out of the ocean, and aimlessly wandering through life. There seems to be more to it.
And you're going to be covering this in the book you're working on right now.
If I ever finish it, I will.
And what's the title going to be?
The Technology Chaser.
Okay. All right, very good. Well, as always, I appreciate your advice and wisdom and knowledge. Our relationship has been one of a master and a student, really. So thank you for the time, for sitting down. I don't want to keep you. I know you guys have family things to take care of. But you know, just because you're moving to Georgia, things don't change down here. You know, out of sight is not out of mind. And just as I've told you in email and on the phone, you've got a whole host of Bill Ryan fan club members that are dedicated to keeping you busy, to keeping you with a mission and a purpose. And don't sell yourself short. Don't give up. Your time is not over yet. You've got so much more to teach and so much more to give. You're going to be just like MacArthur. We don't know when it's going to be, but you're going to come back. That's right. We're going to see him storming up the beach and coming down. But in the meantime, we always, just like in Casablanca, they say we'll always have Paris. Well, we'll always have webcams, Bill. You know, so we'll be able to stay in touch that way.
Okay.
All right. All right. Thank you.